In this video you will learn how to write unit tests inside Angular. And the first thing that I want to mention is that inside Angular, starting from Angular 16, we're using Jest instead of the Karma runner. It doesn't really change a lot from writing test perspective, but you need to remember that. For now, it is possible to use Jest inside Angular, but this feature is still experimental. Obviously, it won't be experimental later, as Karma is in deprecated state. And this is exactly what Angular used previously. So if you want for now to stick with Karma, you can just create an Angular application and write npm run test and you're good to go. If you want to update your code and use Jest instead, there are several steps that you must do. First of all, we must jump inside our Angular JSON and find here a section test. And as you can see here, my builder is written build Angular Jest and not build Angular Karma that we had here previously. Another change that we must do inside our package JSON, we must install several additional libraries. And these are Jest, Jest environment Jest DOM, and types Jest. All these three packages are needed if you want to use Jest inside Angular. Now we can start writing unit tests. And just at the beginning, I want to start with something simple. And inside source app, I have here an error message component. As you can see, inside this component is super small. So here we have a selector MC error message, and here we have a template. And as you can see, this is a standalone component like we're writing in modern Angular applications. Here we have our error message component with just a single input message, which is by default set to something went wrong. And this is exactly what we're rendering inside our template. Now the most important question here is, what is this data test ID? Essentially, previously my component looked like this. I added here this attribute data test ID, and this is the attribute for our unit tests, because inside our unit tests we want to find specific elements, and we don't really want to use some divs or classes because we can remove them later. This attribute is here only for unit tests, which actually means we won't remove it accidentally like some another class. Now let's create our test. So here near my component error message, I want to create error message.component.spec.ts. And this spec is important because this is exactly how Jest will find our spec files. And here we're using a word describe to group tests for our component. And here we typically are writing the name of the component that we want to test. In my case, it is error message component. Now, first of all, here we want to create several properties that we will use across all our tests. And we will have here our component, and it is of type error message component that we just saw. Additionally, after this, we need to create a fixtures property. And this is a component fixture, where inside we are providing our error message component. As you can see here on the top, we imported component fixture from Angular core testing, which actually means we don't need to install anything additionally. Now after this, we must create a before each block, and this block will be executed before every single test. And what we want to call here, we want to create a module where inside we will register our component. And it doesn't really matter that we have standalone components. Our all components we're testing in exactly the same way. It doesn't really matter if it is standalone or not. This is why here we're writing testbed.configure testing module, and it will create a testing module fast. And inside we must provide in the imports our component, and it is error message component. After this, we are calling compile components. This is exactly how we're creating a new module with our component as a dependency. After this, we want to set something inside our fixture, and actually this is not fixtures, this is fixture. And inside we want to write testbed.create component, and we're providing inside our error messages component. Also, we want here a reference to our component by calling fixture.componentInstance. And the last one here is fixture.detect changes. This line is extremely important because it will trigger detect changes for the whole component, and everything will be rendered with correct properties. So this is exactly the code that we will write again and again in every single test where we're creating our component. We will create a testing module, we will throw a component inside, and we will create a fixture, a component, and call detect changes. And now we can write our first test. And typically I like to create a first test just to check that our component is there. So we can write here create component, and here we have our callback, and inside we will just call expect component, this is our property, to be truthy. In this case, our test is green if our component was created successfully. Now we can jump inside console and just call npm run test. I'm sorry for interruption, but I just want to let you know that I have lots of advanced courses on different web technologies where we create real applications and prepare for the interviews. You can find the link in the description box below. Now let's jump back into the video. And this is the output that I'm getting. First of all, here is the note that I'm using Jest builder and it is not production ready. This is totally fine, it is not an error. Now here on the bottom we're getting test suits, one passed, and here we can see that we're testing error message component and our test is create component, which actually means we successfully wrote our first test. Now we can write something better. What we want to test is our component and its default state. And by default, if we didn't provide anything inside our div, we must render something when thrown message. This is why here we can write here it renders default error state. What we want to do now here, we want first to get a DOM element to check the text inside. This is why here let's get a reference to our message container, and we're doing it by calling fixture.debugElement.query. And as you can see here, we have query and query all. And we're using query if we have just a single element. And inside we want to provide by.css, and inside will come our attribute. So it will be data test ID equals here is message container. And this message container is exactly what we created inside our div. So this code is getting back a debug element by this attribute. And as you can see here, it is a debug element. This is not a DOM node. This is why here we can write test like this, expect message container dot, and here we can write native element to get access to the element itself, dot text content to be. And the good idea here is to write first of all a failed test. This is why here I can write foo and we can check if our test is failing. I'm calling npm run test again. And as you can see, our test failed. We have here expected foo and received something went wrong. This is exactly the text that we need to get. This is why here we can just update it and write here something went wrong. As you can see now we have two tests which are passed. So we successfully covered the default state of our component. Now it is time to cover the custom error message. This is why here we can write it renders custom error message. And what we can do here, we can provide an input, and we are doing that by writing component.message equals, for example, email is already taken. And it will be our custom error message. Now here we must write fixture.detect changes. If you forget this line, then you will get the default state. Only detect changes triggers our new input and changing of the property. And after this, what I want to do is copy paste this code from the top. Because what we need to do, again, we must find our message container and we must write an expectation. And here I will just save it like this because I want my test to fail. As you can see, our test is failing, we're getting expected something went wrong, but we got email is already taken, which actually means our input is working correctly and our component is fully configurable. Now we can update this line and change it to email is already taken, and we successfully covered all our cases for the component. Now let's look on more complex component. Here I already prepared pagination component. First of all, we have inside our HTML with some markup, list of pages, and for loop, and click event. Additionally to that, we have our pagination component Jest. First of all, here we are getting several inputs and an output when we clicked on specific page. Additionally to that, we have two local properties, an injection of the service inside our component, and some logic inside ng-on-init where we are calculating pages count and pages. Also here you can see that we have a select page method which emits outside the page that we clicked on. Now we want to write tests for this component. This is why here I can create pagination.component.spec.ts, and I don't want to write everything from scratch. I will copy the spec file completely from our error component and just remove all tests except of the first one. So what we need to update here is just our names. We want to describe here our pagination component, And here we are creating pagination component and we provide it inside our fixture. We also must import it on the top. And inside here we're importing our pagination component and we're creating pagination component. Now here on the top, I can remove this error message component. We don't need it. So as you can see, the standard code is staying exactly the same, and this code must create for us a pagination component. As you can see here, everything is green and our test passed. But before we will start to write our test cases, I must say several words regarding our component. As you can see here, we're getting some inputs, but we're making calculations of these inputs only on initialize. This is the code inside ng-on-init, which actually means it doesn't really matter if later we're changing this total, limit, current page, we won't do this calculation and our component won't be changed. Which actually means in order for it to work, we must set all our inputs at the beginning, which actually means we can jump inside our spec. And before our detect changes, we must set all inputs for our component. Only in this case, we will get correct calculations. This is why here component total is, for example, 50, then component limit, let's say we have 10 per page, and our component.current page is 1. After this, we are calling fixture detect changes, and all these properties are assigned inside the inputs, and our component is created, and all that logic inside ng-on-init is applied. Now here let's try to write some tests. First of all, I want to check how many pages we rendered and if it is correct at all. It renders correct pagination, and inside we must find all our elements. And just to remind you, inside HTML here I already added here data test ID page container, and this is every single with the page inside. This is exactly what we want to find. Here I want to find our page containers, and I'm using here fixture.debugelement.queryAll, which actually means I want to get an array back. And inside I'm providing by CSS, and we're writing this attribute. It is data test ID equals page container, which actually means page containers is an array of debug elements. And now here we can check how many we have. So we're expecting our page containers dot length to be 5. Why 5? Because here we're getting total 50 elements and we have limit 10, which actually means 50 divided by 10, we have 5 pages. This is why here the page containers must equal 5. As you can see, our test passed. Now here it makes a lot of sense to check the content of some elements. This is why here we can write expect, and we have here our page containers, and we can write at 0, which actually means we're getting first page container, but we're not sure if we have something or not. This is why here question mark is mandatory, and we're reading native element text content. So we're reading text content from the first page. This is why here I will write to equal 1. As you can see, our test is mostly correct. We're expecting 1, but we got 1 with 2 spaces. We could check here contains and not equal, or we can simply write spaces in our test. And now it is green. One more test that we must write is a meeting of our value. This is why here let's write it, and we must check that it should emit a clicked page. And first of all, here again I want to copy this code because we need access to our page containers. After this, we need one more property where we will store the page on which we clicked. This is why here let's create clicked page, and it is either number or undefined by default. And now here on our component we have a method which is called page change event, and we can just subscribe on this output. And actually we want to trigger it only once. This is why it makes a lot of sense to write pipe first. And after this, inside our subscribe, we are getting the page, and we can assign inside our clicked page the page that we got from our output emit, which actually means this is the code that you will typically use if you want to subscribe to your outputs. And after this, we must trigger the click event, and for this we will use our page containers at 0, which actually means this is our first page, and we want to call here trigger event handler, and we are providing here click, which actually means with this line we are making click on our first page. After this, we can simply write that we are expecting our clicked page to equal 1. So what we are doing here, first of all, we are finding all our containers. After this, we are creating clicked page. We are subscribing to our change event, and we're assigning inside our clicked page, and we triggered a click on our first page container. Let's check if it's working. As you can see, our test passed. But here we have a huge problem. Why is that? Because inside our page component we have a dependency utility service. And we're using this utility service with the method range. The main problem is that we didn't mock it. And typically we want to fully isolate our component from all dependencies, because our dependencies can be changed and then our test will break. We don't want that. We want to test our component or service completely in isolation. This is why typically we want to mock all dependencies to the thing that we are testing. And inside our code we didn't do that. But we really must do it always. This is why here what we can do is write providers, and inside we are providing an object with provide property, and this is our utility service. This is just a key, but as a value we want to use value, and here I want to create mock utils service, which actually means here we are providing inside just an object that we will create in a second as our utility service. With this line, it won't inject the real utility service inside. Now here on the top I can create mock utility service. This is just an object, and here for our component we need to implement a range function. I won't pass any arguments here at all. I will simply return some mock data, maybe pages from 0 to 5, because here we wrote exactly that. We have here total 50, limit 10, and we have in total 5 pages. This is our mock service, which we're injecting as a provider, and it overrides our utility service. As you can see, our tests are still green, but now here we used our mock utility service. But most importantly to remember, it doesn't really matter what total and limit you will provide inside, we will always get back these pages, because our service is mocked and these data are not dynamic. And the last thing that I want to show you is how to test our service. Just to remind you, here we have our utility service. This is just an injectable service with the range method inside. How we can test this method? Here I want to create utilities service.spec.ts, and inside we can write a describe, and we're describing here our utility service. Now here we want to create a property utils service, which is utils service, and by default it is undefined. After this we want to create before each, just like we did previously, because here also we must use testbed and we must create a module. This is why here inside I can write testbed.configure testing module, and I'm providing inside just a provider, just our service that we want to test. This is an array with our utility service. We don't provide here any component. And after this we can write compile components. After this we want to get a reference to our utility service by using testbed.inject, and we are calling here our token, and in our case it will be utility service. So this is the whole code that you will write every single time when you are testing your services. And after this we can write it create service. And this is our first test to understand that our service was injected correctly. So here we can write expect our utility service to be truthy. As you can see, our test is green, and now we can test our range method. But now it makes a lot of sense to write one more describe inside our describe block to write different tests for our range method. This is why here let's write that we're testing range method, and inside we will have several its. For example, it returns correct result for 1 to 6 range. Now here inside our it we must get a result by calling our utility service dot range, and this is exactly our method, and we can pass inside 1 and 6, and we can also write here our expected result. It will be an array from 1 to 5, because we don't include in our array the second number of the range. Now here we can just write that we're expecting our result to equal expected. As you can see, our test passed. Now let's copy-paste this test and try it with different numbers. For example, here is a range from 41 to 45, and we're providing inside our range 41 and 45, and then our range here must be 41, 42, 43 and 44. As you can see, our tests are green. And actually, if you're interested to know how to implement function overloading inside TypeScript, make sure to check this video also.